Thank you for joining us around the fire. For more information or to make a donation, please visit randomactsnetwork.com. Now, want to hear a scary story?
It was on the top shelf of an old bookcase, covered with dust and barely visible. Lisa decided she had to find out what it was. Of all the things in the old junk shop, it aroused her curiosity the most. She had looked through old books, prints, and postcards for hours. Nothing had caught her interest, but the old box, high and out of reach, intrigued her. She looked around for the old man who ran the store, but he had gone into the back room. She saw a stepladder across the room and brought it over to the bookcase. It shook on the uneven floorboards as she climbed to the top step. Lisa patted her hand along the surface of the top shelf, trying to find the box. The dirt was thick and gritty on the board. Then she felt it. The cardboard was cold and soft from being in the damp room for such a long time. She lifted the box down slowly, trying to steady her balance on the ladder. As the side of the box reached her eye level, she could read the words, 500 pieces, stepladder, and climbed down a few steps. Then she blew away some of the dust off the lid. It billowed up around her with a musty, dead odor, but now she could make out a few more words on top of the box. The strangest jigsaw puzzle in the world. There were more words underneath that, but they had been rubbed away from the cardboard lid. The big picture on the cover had been curiously damaged. Lisa could just make out some areas of light and dark. It looked as though the scene might be in a room, but most of the picture had been scratched off the cardboard box, probably with some sharp instrument. The mysterious nature of the jigsaw puzzle made it even more appealing to Lisa. She decided she would buy it. The lid was taped securely, which probably meant that all the pieces would still be there. As she carefully climbed down the stepladder, holding the box in both hands, Lisa smiled to herself. It was quite a find, just the sort of thing she had always hoped to discover while rummaging through second-hand stores. The owner of the store came out of the back room as she was walking up to the sales desk. He looked curiously at the box when Lisa set it down. "And where did you find that?" he asked her. Lisa pointed to where she had set up the stepladder. "It was on top of that bookcase. You could barely see it from the floor."
"Well, I've never seen it before, that's for sure," the man said. "Can't imagine how you found it."
Lisa was more pleased than ever about her find. She felt as though the puzzle had been hiding up there, waiting for her to discover it. She paid the 25 cents he asked for the puzzle and wrapped it carefully in the newspapers he gave her to take it home in. It was late on a Saturday afternoon. Lisa lived alone in a small room in an old apartment house. She had no plans for Saturday night, so now she decided to spend the whole evening working on the puzzle. She stopped and bought some meat, bread, and cheese for sandwiches. She would eat while she put the puzzle together. As soon as she had climbed the flight of stairs to her room and put away the groceries, Lisa cleaned off the big table in the center of the room and set the box down on it. The strangest jigsaw puzzle in the world. Lisa read the words again. She wondered what that could mean. How strange could a jigsaw puzzle be? The tape that held the lid down was still strong. Lisa got out a kitchen knife to slice through it. When she lifted the cover off the box, a musty smell came from inside, but the jigsaw pieces all looked in good condition. Lisa picked one up. The color was faded, but the picture was clear. She could see the shape of a finger in the piece. It looked like a woman's finger. Lisa sat down and started to lay out the pieces, top side up on the large table. As she took them from the box, she sorted out the flat-edged pieces from the inside ones. Every so often, she would recognize something in one of the pieces. She saw some blonde hair, a window pane, and a small vase. There was a lot of wood texture in the pieces, plus what looked like wallpaper. Lisa noticed that the wallpaper in the puzzle looked a lot like the wallpaper in her own room. She wondered if her wallpaper was as old as the Jigsaw Puzzle. It would be an incredible coincidence, but it could be the same. By the time Lisa had all the pieces laid out on the table, it was 6:30. She got up and made herself a sandwich. Already, her back was beginning to hurt a little from leaning over the table, but she couldn't stay away from the puzzle. She went back to the table and set her sandwich down beside her. It was always like that when she did jigsaws. Once she started, she couldn't stop until the puzzle was all put together. She began to sort the pieces according to color. There were dark brown pieces, whitish pieces, the wallpaper pieces, and some that seemed to be like glass, perhaps a window. As she slowly ate her sandwich, Lisa pieced together the border. When she was finished, she knew she had been right about the setting of the picture when she had first seen the puzzle. It was a room. One side of the border was wallpaper. Lisa decided to fill that in first. She was curious about its resemblance to her own wallpaper. She gathered all the pieces together that had the blue and lilac flower design. As she fit them together, it became clear that the wallpaper in the puzzle was identical to the wallpaper in her room. Lisa glanced back and forth between the puzzle and her wall. It was an exact match. By now, it was 8:30. Lisa leaned back in her chair. Her back was stiff. She looked over at her window. The night was black outside. Lisa got up and walked over to the window. Suddenly, she felt uneasy, alone in the apartment, and she pulled the white shade down. She paced around the room once, trying to think of something else she might do other than finish the puzzle, but nothing else interested her, so she went back and sat down at the table. Next, she started to fill in the lower right-hand corner. There was a rug and then a chair. This part of the puzzle was very dark. Lisa noticed uneasily that the chair was the same shape as one sitting in the corner of her room, but the colors didn't seem exactly the same. Her chair was maroon. The one in the puzzle seemed almost black. Lisa continued to fill in the border toward the middle. There was more wallpaper to finish on top. The left-hand side did turn out to be a window. Through it, a half-moon hung in a dark sky. But it was the bottom of the puzzle that began to bother Lisa. As the pieces fell into place, she saw a picture of a pair of legs crossed underneath a table. They were the legs of a young woman. Lisa reached down and ran her hand along one of her legs. Suddenly, she felt as though something was crawling up it, but it must have been her imagination. She stared down at the puzzle. It was almost 3/4 done. Only the middle remained. Lisa glanced at the lid to the puzzle box. The strangest jigsaw puzzle, she shuddered. Lisa leaned back in her chair again. Her back ached. Her neck muscle was tense and strained. She thought about quitting the puzzle completely. It scared her now. She stood up and stretched. Then she looked down at the puzzle on the table. It looked different from the higher angle. Lisa was shocked by what she saw. Her body began to tremble all over. It was unmistakable. The picture in the puzzle was her own room. The window was placed correctly in relation to the table. The bookcase stood in its exact spot against the wall. Even the carved legs of the table were the same. Lisa raised her hand to knock the pieces of the puzzle apart. She didn't want to finish it. She didn't want to find out what the hole in the middle of the puzzle might turn out to be. But then she lowered her hand. Perhaps it was worse not to know. Perhaps it was worse to wait and wonder. Lisa sank back down into the chair at the table. She fought away the fear that crept into the sore muscles of her back. Deliberately, piece by piece, she began to fill in the hole in the puzzle. She put together a picture of a table on which lay a jigsaw puzzle. This puzzle inside the puzzle was finished, but Lisa couldn't make out what it showed. She pieced together the young woman who was sitting at the table, the young woman who was herself. As she filled in the picture, Her own body slowly filled with horror and dread. It was all there in the picture. The vase filled with blue cornflowers, her red cardigan sweater, the wild look of fear in her own face. The jigsaw lay before her, finished except for 2 adjoining pieces. They were dark pieces, ones she hadn't been able to fit into the area of the window. Lisa looked behind her. The white blind was drawn over the window. With relief, she realized that the puzzle picture was not exactly like her room. It showed the black night behind the window pane and a moon shining in the sky. With trembling hands, Lisa reached for the second-to-last piece. She dropped it into one of the empty spaces. It seemed to be half a face, but not a human face. She reached for the last piece. She pressed it into the small hole left in the picture. The face was complete. The face in the window. It was more horrible than anything she had ever seen or dreamed. Lisa looked at the picture of herself in the puzzle, and then back at that face. Then she whirled around. The blind was no longer down over her window. The night showed black through the window pane. A half moon hung low in the sky. And Lisa screamed. The face was there too. Long ago, a small village was plagued by a monster. The monster had never been seen nor heard. It never left tracks or evidence. The only proof of its existence was its victims. The victims were always killed in the same manner. 10 jagged holes would be found in their necks. At first, the monster attacked only small animals. A farmer woke one morning to find that 3 of his sheep had bled to death. Then, 3 pet dogs in the village were found dead, with the same strange claw marks in their necks. Rumors circulated in the village. Everyone heard about the animals, but no one could give a logical explanation for what had killed them. Next, a young calf was found dead. It had bled to death too, its jugular vein punctured by the 10 mysterious holes. After this, men began to arm themselves. Shotguns were set beside beds at night. Animals were kept locked inside the barns. Throughout the village, a rash of hysteria broke loose. People put forth all kinds of wild speculation, and neighbors eyed each other with suspicion. Then it happened, what everyone had really feared. The monster attacked a human, Elmer Riley, the town drunk. Elmer was found dead one morning, with the 10 claw holes in his neck. He had died just like the sheep and the dogs and the calf. He had bled to death. Not many people in the town really cared that Elmer was dead, but it scared them to know that the monster had an appetite for humans as well. Anyone could be its prey. The men of the village banded together to form a vigilante group. They didn't know what they were fighting, which made things even worse. 2 brothers, Robert and John Harmon, were appointed head of the vigilante committee. They lived on the outskirts of the village, near the forest where most people thought the monster lived. The 2 brothers knew how the monster attacked. It had been their calf that was killed. After the first meeting of the vigilante committee, Robert and John Harmon went home to discuss their plans. They sat around the oak table in the kitchen with their father. Their old grandmother sat by the fireplace on a low chair, her black shawl wrapped around her. "We must begin the watch tonight," Robert said in a low voice. "The other men are afraid to act now, but I think tonight is the time to be on guard." "You're right," his brother agreed. "The thing, whatever it is, strikes every 5 days. It was 5 nights ago that Elmer Riley was killed." "You boys sound brave," their father interrupted. "But remember what you are dealing with. The thing seems to attack without warning. In the killing so far, there were no signs of struggle. How will you know what to watch for? The father paused and looked over at his old mother sitting by the fireplace. They should be careful, shouldn't they, Granny? The old woman looked up at her son. She shuddered for a moment and then fell silent again. The three men went back to their conversation. They hadn't really expected to get an answer from her. Her mind had been foggy for years. Robert began to outline his plan for his father. John and I will both take our guns to the outskirts of the forest tonight. We'll set ourselves up on the path between the forest and the village. If the monster comes out tonight, it'll have to pass by either one of us. And what protection will you have? The father asked worriedly. Each other, Robert answered. We'll stay within shouting distance of each other, and we'll keep our backs to the village so that we face the forest and the monster. Someone has to do it, John said next to his father. We don't know who the next victim will be. We can't just sit back and let the monster kill us off one by one. Their father stood up from the table and walked a lap around the room. Then he shook each of their hands. Please come back to me alive, he said, his voice choking. The two sons picked up their rifles from the floor. Robert pulled a long, sharp machete from off the wall. As they left the room, both of them walked over to their old grandmother and kissed her goodbye. Outside, the night was nearly pitch black. A thin sliver of a moon hung low in the western sky. They walked east, toward the forest. As they drew near to where they had planned to station themselves, John whispered, I wonder what it looks like. I've been thinking, Robert said, that it could be a bird. A giant bird that swoops down on you and digs its claws into your neck. They both looked up into the night sky. Clouds were shrouding the thin moon. It would be hard to see a dark shadow descending through the sky. I thought it might tunnel under the ground like a huge weasel, John said softly. Then it comes out and attacks you from behind. Both brothers felt the skin crawl on the backs of their necks. Slowly they turned around and looked behind them. For several minutes they stood there like that in the dark, paralyzed by their own horrible thoughts. We must take our places, Robert said finally. But remember, stay within shouting distance. The two brothers moved off in opposite directions. They had agreed to take 20 long paces and then stop. Standing in the dark, Robert carefully cocked his gun. Then he took the machete and stuck it in the soft ground by his feet, and waited. 40 paces away, John fumbled nervously with his gun. He felt his hands shaking. Could he use the gun if he had to? He wished he could see Robert, but his brother was obscured by the dark shadows of bushes and trees. John turned around to look toward the village. He wished he were safe inside the house. Then he heard the crackling of a twig in back of him. He spun around to face the forest, but saw nothing and heard no more. John relaxed. He set the butt of his gun down on the ground and leaned against it, and he started to feel drowsy. And then he felt the 10 claws digging into his neck. A terrified scream echoed through the forest to Robert. He grabbed his gun and machete and followed the awful screams to his brother. He drew near but couldn't see anything in the dark night. But then he heard John's voice, choking and desperate. Quick! Swing the machete behind where you hear my voice! Hurry! Robert threw down his gun, grasping the machete in both hands. He swung it above his head and let it fall. It made a hacking sound before it hit the ground. John had been groaning the whole time, but now he stopped. For an instant, Robert thought he had killed his brother. But then John started to babble incoherently. Robert thought he heard something moving back away from them. It sounded like a giant rat scuttling over the dead leaves. But he could not see it. He fell down on the ground by his brother's body. Moaning again, John took his brother's hand and put it up to his own neck. Robert shrunk back at what he felt. It was a hand, a withered hand with sharp, pointed claws. He had hacked it off the monster with his machete. and it was still stuck inside of John's neck. Robert jerked the foul claws from his brother's neck and bound the 10 bloody holes with his handkerchief. He carried his brother back to the village, leaving the withered hand lying on the forest floor. Their father met them at the door, weeping with fear. He had heard John's terrified screams in the forest. Now he wept with happiness to see that both his sons were alive yet. They laid John out on the couch and washed out the claw marks in his neck. They could see that a few seconds more and the claws would have killed him. As he bandaged his brother's neck, Robert thought about the monster. He hoped it was in the forest now, dying a slow death. All this time, no one had noticed that the old woman was gone from her spot by the fireplace. And no one noticed when she came in through the back door and sat down there again. From her low seat, she looked over to Robert and John. No one heard the hiss that came from her wrinkled mouth, and no one saw the bloody stump that she hid underneath her black shawl. The 5 girls were sleeping over in an old house that belonged to one of their grandmothers. The house was big and drafty, but the friends were gathered around a fireplace in the study. Michelle threw another log on the fire to keep it going, and they all watched as the embers glowed brighter and the orange-tipped flames jumped up from the dry wood. Suddenly, there was a loud crack as the wood began to burn, making everyone jump and laugh nervously. "Want to tell some scary stories?" Michelle asked in a soft whisper. At first, everyone was quiet and just looked at each other's faces in the firelight. "My older sister told me one last weekend," Kate said. "It's called Bloody Mary." Everyone stared at Mary. Then Michelle grabbed her hand and said, "Look, no blood." "I'm not talking about our Mary," Kate said. "I mean the real Bloody Mary. She was the Queen of England a long time ago." "So why was she called Bloody Mary?" Ellen asked. "Because she chopped off people's heads, that's why. If someone didn't do what Bloody Mary wanted, she had them condemned to death. They were led to the chopping block. They had to put their heads on the block, and then an executioner with a black hood over his head came up with a big, shiny axe, and chop, their heads would roll away." Screams of disgust filled the room. "But that's not all," Kate went on. "There's an old superstition about Bloody Mary." All the girls drew closer to hear what Kate was going to say, especially Mary. She loved to hear scary stories, and she'd never heard the one about Bloody Mary before. "They say," Kate began again, "that Bloody Mary still comes back. That if you go into a room with a mirror at night, and you turn off all the lights, Bloody Mary will appear." Kate stopped for a few seconds and looked around at her friends' faces. All their eyes were staring at her, and Mary's in particular looked strangely shiny and excited. "So you stand in a dark, dark room with no lights on, right in front of the mirror, and you begin to chant the words, 'I do believe in Bloody Mary. I do believe in Bloody Mary,' over and over again. Then, if you've done everything just right, Bloody Mary's face will slowly appear in the mirror, and finally, you'll find out why she's really called Bloody Mary." Kate stopped talking, and all the girls but Mary started to make scary sounds and talk about what Bloody Mary might look like. But Mary sat quietly in the dark, staring into the jumping flames of the fireplace. For a second, she thought she saw a face there, staring back at her. But then the fire made a loud crack and the log broke in two, sending a shower of embers up into the fireplace. Mary gasped, shaking her head as though she were coming out of a dream. "Look at Mary," Michelle said.
She looks bloody!"
Everyone started to scream and laugh. Mary had drawn so close to the fire that her face was flushed red, and the shadows of the flickering flames made her face look as though it were streaked with blood. Mary felt her hot cheeks and drew back from the fire into a dark corner where her sleeping bag was spread out. The other girls started to share another scary story, but Mary couldn't concentrate on what they were saying. Her eyes grew heavy, and in her mind a shadowy face appeared and disappeared until it became a part of her dreams. Mary woke up with a start, confused about where she was. She sat up and stared into the darkness until her eyes picked out the tiny, bright glow of a few dying embers in the fireplace. At first, Mary thought they were animal eyes staring at her. Then, she remembered where she was. At a sleepover, at Michelle's grandmother's house. As her eyes slowly became more accustomed to the darkness, Mary could make out the sleeping figures of her 4 friends, huddled around the fireplace in their sleeping bags. Then, with a shock, she remembered Bloody Mary. The story seemed so real now, as though she heard it only moments ago. Then she remembered her dreams, how Bloody Mary had haunted her sleep. Suddenly, an idea crept into Mary's mind. It wrapped itself around her brain and wouldn't let go. She tried to force the thought away by concentrating on something else, but it always came back, stronger than before. The thought told her to find out if the story was true, to see what happened if she called to Bloody Mary in a dark room in front of a mirror. Almost against her will, Mary pulled her legs out of her warm sleeping bag and stood up in the shadowy room. She began to walk across the room, stepping over the bodies of her sleeping friends. Mary reached the door to the study, pulled it open, and walked through. She found herself standing at the bottom of the creaky staircase that climbed up to the second floor. Quietly, like a cat, she crept up the stairs to the landing. The first door on the right was closed. Mary knew it was the room where Michelle's grandmother slept. She turned to the left down the hall and kept walking until she came to the very last door. Slowly and carefully, she turned the knob and stepped inside. Mary shut the door behind her and felt for a light switch on the wall. For a brief moment, light flooded the room, long enough for Mary to see the big mirror in an old-fashioned frame hanging on the wall. She flicked the lights back off and, like a sleepwalker, moved slowly but deliberately toward the mirror. She reached out in the darkness and touched its cold, smooth surface a foot away from where she stopped. Just then, the moon broke through the clouds in the night sky and a thin shaft of moonlight pierced the darkness of the room. Mary gasped as she saw a face appear in the mirror. Then, as she watched the face slowly smile, she realized that it was her own. The story isn't true, she told herself. Just a silly superstition. Then she remembered the words. She hadn't said the words yet. She hadn't called for Bloody Mary. She raised her hands toward the mirror and slowly began to chant. I do believe in Bloody Mary. I do believe in Bloody Mary. She kept staring into the mirror, but only her face, with frightened-looking eyes, stared back at her. I do believe in Bloody Mary. I do believe in Bloody Mary. The eyes in the mirror didn't look frightened anymore. They were hard and seemed to glow. Mary didn't understand why her mouth was turning down in such a wicked smile, but she kept on chanting. I do believe in Bloody Mary. I do believe in Bloody Mary. The face in the mirror had skin that was pocked and spotted with a rough red rash, and the hair seemed to curl out of the head like black snakes. I do believe in Bloody Mary. I do believe in Bloody Mary. Her voice kept chanting. And then, two hands, 2 bloody hands reached up beside the face in the mirror. Mary stopped chanting, and a scream started to rise in her throat. She stared at the face of Bloody Mary in the mirror and saw the bloody hands reach right out of the mirror toward her. The bloody hands grabbed hold of Mary's neck as she began to scream and scream and scream. When her friends flicked on the light of the bedroom, they saw Mary suddenly collapse onto the floor in front of the mirror. Running over to her, they saw the blood smeared around her neck. Then Mary looked up at them with crazed eyes and began to chant over and over, "I do believe in Bloody Mary. I do believe in Bloody Mary. I do believe in Bloody Mary." The friends looked into the mirror on the wall, but the face of Bloody Mary was gone. All they saw were their own faces, with frightened eyes, staring back at them. I do believe in Bloody Mary. I do believe in Bloody Mary. I do believe in Bloody Mary. The winter days were long and lonely in the Tennessee hills, but the nights were even longer. Matt lived on a remote farm in a deep valley surrounded by mountains that hunched up against the sky. One night, he sat around the fireplace with his father and Jeb Adams, a neighbor who had come to visit. His mother and Mrs. Adams were busy chatting in another room. "It's that time again," Jeb said, "when the witch cat starts to prowl." Matt turned his eyes from the fire to stare at Jeb's face and then his father's. He saw that his father had raised his eyebrows at Jeb as a signal to be quiet. "The boy should know," Jeb said, "especially with you and his mother going off to the state capitol next week. He should know about the witch cat." Just then, Matt's mother came into the room with Mrs. Adams, who measured Matt up and down with her sharp green eyes. "Time to go home," she announced. "We'll be back soon enough to pick up Matt when you take your trip to the Capitol." As soon as the Adams left, Matt followed his father outside to the stable. He had to feed the new colt his father had given him, and he also wanted to hear about the witch cat. "Your mother doesn't want you to know about this boy," his father said. "But maybe Jeb's right. The witch has been prowling around these hills for over 20 years. I say prowling because she changes shape from woman into a big, black cat. Not a natural-sized cat, mind you, but a big black cat the size of a hunting dog. People who've seen the witch say her eyes glow yellow in the night and her teeth are like fangs. The witch cat kills livestock, even horses." Matt's father stopped when he saw Matt staring down at the small colt. "We'll only be gone 2 days," he said. "Don't you let Mr. Adams get you worried." On the day his parents left, Mrs. Adams came to the house without Jeb. She told Matt that her husband was too busy with the livestock to come over and get him. They decided she would stay the night with Matt at his house instead. Matt didn't like the idea, but since his parents were already on their way, he couldn't do anything about it. He spent the day doing his chores, and that night he sat around the fire with Mrs. Adams. For a March night, it had gotten very cold with a gusty wind whipping around the sides of the house. "Hear about the witch cat?" Mrs. Adams said. "It's prowling round again." "Where?" Matt asked, hoping his voice wasn't shaking. "On the other side of Pepper Hill last night," Mrs. Adams said. "It killed a calf." Matt shivered and pulled his wool sweater tighter around his neck. He thought of his little colt alone in the stable outside. Mrs. Adams suddenly yawned and stretched her arms and legs. She told Matt she was ready to turn in for the night, but he thought she didn't look tired at all. Her eyes were bright and shiny. Still, he got ready to go to bed. She watched as he climbed the flight of wooden steps up to the loft bedroom. Then he heard her close the door to his parents' bedroom where she was going to sleep. Matt couldn't rest no matter how many sheep he counted. The wind was whining and moaning now, and the glass rattled in the window panes. Then a sound came out of the night that made his blood run cold. It was the meow of a cat, but it was so loud that Matt heard it over the moaning of the wind. The meowing kept on and on, moving around the outside of the house. Matt raised himself up on his trembling elbows and turned his head toward the small window that looked out over the barnyard. It was there in the moonlight, the shadowy shape of a huge black cat. Matt watched as it slowly raised its head toward the second story of the house where he lay. He saw its yellow eyes glowing in the moonlight. Then, as Matt watched, the witch cat turned away and began to stalk toward the stable. Matt knew what the witch cat was after. It wanted his colt. He jumped up and pulled on his clothes and boots. He scrambled down the steps and called out Mrs. Adams' name, but there was no answer. Just then, Matt heard a terrible screech from the witch cat, closer now to the colt's stable. He pulled on a jacket and reached for the big hunting knife that his father kept in the hallway. Grabbing it tightly, he pulled open the door. The March wind cut into his face as Matt rushed across the barnyard toward the stable. As he drew closer, he saw the stable door was standing wide open. He swallowed the lump of fear that had risen in his throat and crept inside. The moonlight was shining down through a window into the colt's pen, where the poor animal was cowering in a corner. In front of it was the giant witch cat, its long, sharp fangs glistening as it snarled at the colt. Just as the witch cat leapt forward, Matt lunged at it with his hunting knife. The knife sliced down on its right front paw. Blood spurted out. Matt jumped back as the witch cat screamed in pain. Then he looked down and saw the pool of blood on the stable floor. Matt watched as the witch cat limped out of the stable, hissing and snarling. When it was gone, he stooped down to pet his colt. Seeing the blood nearby, he kicked straw over it in disgust. Suddenly, Matt began to shake with cold and fear. He wanted to be back inside the house, safe and warm. He pulled shut the stable door and bolted it. Then he ran through the shadows of the barnyard into the house. He remembered as he closed the kitchen door that he had left the hunting knife in the stable. A strange sound came from near the fireplace. Matt raised his eyes to see Mrs. Adams sitting in front of the leaping flames. The sound he heard was a weird hissing coming from her mouth. Her eyes seemed to be glowing yellow in the firelight. And then Matt noticed her right hand, which was slowly dripping blood onto the farmhouse floor. Henry Archer woke with a start, feeling as though he were coming out of a long nightmare. He remembered that he had been sick for weeks, deathly sick. He remembered the doctor standing over his bed and shaking his head as though there were no hope. The faces of his nephews were there too, their glittering eyes staring down on his weak body. At the time, Henry's confused thoughts had cleared enough to realize that they wanted him to die, wanted him dead so they could inherit all of his money. Now Henry was feeling better than he had during all those long weeks of illness. The only problem he seemed to be having was a certain shortness of breath, and the night was so dark and his bed unusually hard. Henry shifted his body, feeling how stiff and cold it seemed. Then he raised his hands, which were crossed over his chest, to stretch them. To his surprise, he hit a hard wooden board only several inches above his body. At first, Henry thought he must still be asleep and dreaming. He knew of no place like this that he'd ever been before. His hands groped around to feel what kind of place it was. The more he examined it, the more he came to realize that he was in some sort of wooden box. The air was suddenly heavier around him than before. Henry's mind raced through the possibilities. He could think of no other reason why he might be in a wooden box than if it were a coffin. Through the panic creeping into his brain, Henry remembered that if he were in a coffin, he would be dressed in his best clothes, not the night clothes of a sick man. With a sinking heart, he passed his hand over the smooth silk tie lying on his chest, with his big diamond stick pin fastened through it. He remembered what he had written in his will, that he be buried with his diamond stick pin. Buried alive! Henry's mind sank into horror. The doctor must have thought him dead and buried him alive. Though he was not dead, he surely would be in a few more hours. Henry pushed up his knees against the coffin lid, but it didn't budge. He thought of the 6 feet of earth piled on top of him. Nothing he could do would move that weight. A scream of despair rose in Henry's throat and echoed off the walls of the coffin. He didn't know how he could endure the slow, horrible death that awaited him. And then, through the thoughts that tortured him, came a sound of something moving above him. It scratched against the dirt with sharp, steady movements. Every muscle in Henry's body tensed. What could be working through the ground of a graveyard with such persistence? Henry thought of those horrible tales about graveyard rats. People said they got bigger than cats. They dug down to freshly buried coffins, then they chewed through the wood to get to the corpse inside. Henry shook with fear as the digging sound above him came closer and closer. He felt the air in the coffin become thicker and hotter. Now he had to face the choice of 2 terrible deaths. Suddenly, there was a dull scratch against the top of his coffin lid. Henry imagined how big a rat must be to make that sound. He tried to push up against the lid, but it was fastened tight. He would have to lie there, like a helpless victim, until the rats had gnawed through the lid. There was more scratching against the lid. Then, out of the darkness above him, Henry heard a muffled voice.
"Almost got it now,"
the voice said.
"All that's left is taken off the lid,"
said a second voice. Henry's body froze in shock. It wasn't rats that were after his body. It was grave robbers. He heard a crowbar being wedged under the coffin lid. Then, with a creak, it started to raise.
"You get the diamond stick pin,"
the first voice said.
"Uncle Henry paid thousands for it. It must be worth a fortune." "No use letting it sit on a corpse,"
said the second voice. Just then, the 2 young men pulled off the lid and stared down at the corpse of their uncle. And as their greedy hands reached down to grab for his stick pin, Henry Archer rose out of his coffin and pulled them down into the grave. And he left them there, screaming with terror, as he walked back to town, brushing off the dirt that had fallen onto his diamond stick pin. On a crisp autumn evening, a young couple named Emily and Mark were driving through the dense woods of northern Michigan. They were on their way to visit his mother, who lived in a quaint, secluded town known for its charm and scenic beauty. Typically, they would have arrived in time for supper, but a series of delays and a late start had caused them to fall behind schedule. As the sun dipped down below the horizon, and darkness began to blanket the landscape, they decided it was best to find a place to stay for the night and continue the journey in the morning. As they navigated the winding road, the headlights of their car flickered across a small, dilapidated house nestled deep in the woods. It looked as though it had been forgotten by time itself, overgrown with vines and shrouded in shadows. Emily squinted through the windshield, her curiosity piqued. "Maybe they can rent us a room," she suggested, her voice tinged with hopeful optimism. Mark hesitated, but eventually agreed that it was worth checking out. They pulled up the gravel driveway, the crunching of stones under the tires the only sound breaking the eerie silence of the forest. The house, though modest, seemed warm and inviting, with a soft glow emanating from the windows. Mark knocked on the door, and after a few moments, it creaked open to reveal an elderly couple. The man was tall and wiry, with a thick white beard that nearly reached his chest. His eyes were sharp and bright, and he greeted them with a smile that seemed both kind and weary. His wife was a small, delicate woman with silver hair pulled into a tight bun. She had a gentle demeanor and welcomed them with a warm hug. "We don't rent rooms," she said kindly, "but we're happy to have you stay as our guests. We have plenty of space, and we'd enjoy the company." Grateful for their hospitality, Emily and Mark accepted the offer. The old woman quickly set about preparing a pot of coffee and slicing a rich, homemade cake. They all gathered in the cozy living room, where the scents of freshly brewed coffee mingled with the sweet aromas of the cake. The walls were lined with old photographs and strange artifacts. The elderly couple regaled them with stories of the house and the surrounding woods, tales that seemed to blend fact and folklore in a manner that left the young couple feeling uneasy but intrigued. After an hour or so of conversation, the elderly man led Emily and Mark to their room. It was quaint and surprisingly modern, with a neatly made bed and a large window that overlooked the dense forest. They again offered to pay for their stay, but the old man insisted. "No need for that. We're just happy to have you here." The young couple went to bed. The creaking of the old house and the occasional rustle of leaves outside their window their only lullabies. They rose early the next morning, careful not to disturb their hosts. On a table near the front door, they left an envelope with a generous sum of money, hoping to express their gratitude. Then they quietly made their way back to the car and set off towards the next town. Emily and Mark enjoyed a hearty breakfast at a small diner, where they recounted their overnight stay to the restaurant owner, a burly man with a thick mustache and a kind smile. The owner's face turned ashen as he listened. "That can't be," he said in disbelief. "That house burned down 2 years ago. The couple who lived there perished in the fire." Emily and Mark exchanged stunned glances, their hearts racing. They were certain of what they had seen and experienced, so they decided to return to the house, hoping to clear up the confusion. As they approached the familiar gravel driveway, their hearts sank. The house was no longer there. In its place was a charred skeleton of what once was, a burned-out shell that lay silently amid the encroaching forest. Emily and Mark got out of the car, their footsteps crunching on the gravel as they approached the ruins. The sight of the devastation was almost too much to bear. Mark noticed something unusual amid the debris and pointed it out to Emily. Among the scattered remnants of the house, a charred table lay partially burned under the ash and rubble. Emily's breath caught in her throat as she recognized the shape of the table. It was the very one they had seen by the front door. Mark knelt beside it and with trembling hands began to sift through the debris. A low, mournful cry escaped Emily as she saw what lay on the table. The envelope they had left behind the previous night was unmistakably there, partially scorched but still intact. Mark gingerly picked it up, his fingers trembling as he opened it. The money inside was still crisp and untouched by the flames. As they stood there, stunned and speechless, the air seemed to grow colder, and a faint whispering sound rustled through the trees, as though the forest itself was lamenting. Unable to comprehend what had happened, Emily and Mark stumbled back to their car and drove away in silence, the image of the burned-out house and the envelope now burned into their memories. Their once mundane journey had become an encounter with the inexplicable, a night spent in a place where time and reality blurred, and a reminder that sometimes the boundary between the living and the dead is not as solid as it seems. The house had vanished, the fire had claimed it, but the memory of that eerie night lingered. In a quaint little town where everyone knew each other's business, the news of a formal dance at the old Grand Hotel spread like wildfire. The excitement was palpable, and it seemed that no one could talk of anything else. Among those eagerly awaiting the event was a young man named Thomas. Handsome and kind-hearted, Thomas had his eye on a young woman from his school named Clara. Clara was sweet and gentle, but her family was not well off. Despite her modest means, Thomas thought she would be the perfect companion for the dance. And so one afternoon, he presented her with a bouquet of fresh wildflowers, which he'd picked and arranged especially for her. She was overjoyed by the gesture, and even more so to accept his invitation to the dance. As she walked home, Clara basked in the fluorescence of her bouquet, her chest filled with warmth as she inhaled deeply, and the gentle breeze carried her name through the flowers. She'd never felt so special, so eager for what was to come. But as Thomas saved up for a new suit and made reservations at a charming restaurant, Clara had no idea what she was going to wear. She didn't have any money, especially not for an outfit she'd only wear on one occasion, nor did she have any sisters or any friends of a similar size. Clara was fretting about it for days, and her excitement was overtaken by anxiety as the evening of the dance approached. "Maybe you can rent a dress," her mother suggested gently one morning. Clara's face brightened at the idea. Though she was skeptical about finding something elegant enough, she decided to take her mother's advice. There was a pawn shop not far from their home filled with forgotten curiosities, and Clara made her way there, her heart pounding with both hope and trepidation. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of old leather and dust. The shopkeeper, a gruff man with a bushy mustache, eyed her intensely as she browsed through the racks of clothing and trinkets. After what felt like an eternity, Clara's eyes landed on a beautiful white satin evening gown. It was delicate, with intricate lacework and a shimmering, elegant sheen, and it was her size, too. Clara hesitated for a moment, her fingers brushing against the smooth fabric. The price tag was modest, and the shopkeeper offered an even lower rate when he saw her interest. "I'll take it," she said, her voice filled with a mix of relief and excitement. She could hardly believe her luck. The shopkeeper wrapped the gown in papers, and Clara took it home, her spirits lifted. When the night of the dance arrived, Clara was a vision of grace and beauty. The gown hugged her figure perfectly. Thomas, upon seeing her, was awestruck. They made their way to the hotel, and as they entered, the ballroom was abuzz with admiration. Clara felt like she was walking on air, her worries forgotten. The evening was everything she had dreamed of. She danced with Thomas and many others, her laughter mingling with the music. But as the night wore on, Clara began to feel faint and dizzy. She put it down to the excitement and exertion of dancing. "I think I've danced too much," she told Thomas, her voice barely above a whisper. Concern etched onto his face.
He helped her out of the ballroom and into the cool night air. They arrived at Clara's small home, where she went straight to her room. Thomas, though reluctant to leave her, returned to the dance. He promised to check in on her later. Clara lay down in her bed, hoping that a good rest would help her feel better. Morning came, but Clara did not wake. Her mother, frantic with worry, found her daughter's lifeless body in the early hours of the day, cold and unresponsive. Her mother's screams pierced the quiet house, drawing neighbors and Thomas, who had returned to check on Clara. The doctor was called, and he conducted a preliminary examination. He was baffled by the cause of Clara's death and suggested an autopsy to uncover the mystery. The coroner, a meticulous man with a reputation for thoroughness, undertook the task with solemn care. The results were chilling. Clara had been poisoned, but not by any conventional means. The autopsy revealed traces of embalming fluid in her bloodstream, the substance used to preserve bodies, and it was determined that the fabric had contained a lethal amount of the toxic fluid, which soaked into Clara's pores as she danced. The shopkeeper was questioned, and after some prodding, he admitted that the gown had come from an undertaker's helper. The helper had sold it to him under the guise of a donation, but it had not been a donation at all. The dress had been worn by a young woman who passed away tragically. The helper stole it just before the woman was buried, hoping to make a quick profit. Thomas was devastated by the news, and Clara's mother was left to mourn her daughter. The pawn shop was closed, and the shopkeeper and undertaker's helper were both arrested, though the damage was already done. The Grand Hotel where the dance had been became a symbol of sorrow, a place where no one would dare host a joyful event, and eventually it shuttered as well. The story became a cautionary tale whispered by mothers to their daughters, a reminder that dangers can lurk in the most unexpected places. But amidst the grief, a memorial was erected in her honor, a quiet garden where wildflowers bloomed every spring. Though Clara was gone, her memory lived on, not in the haunting silence of an empty ballroom, but in the gentle breeze that carried her name through the flowers.